Good evening, everyone. Thanks for attending my lecture recital, Beyond Text, whether in person or tuning in live through the live stream. The topic I have for you this evening is a question at the very heart of our work as musicians. How does one craft an interpretation of a piece of music? And more specifically, how can you find a fresh perspective on repertoire that's already quite familiar to concert audiences? What tools do we have at our disposal? In the world of Western classical music, we've inherited all of this ink on pages from composers of the past whom we revere as geniuses of art, and we are tasked with continuing to breathe new life into these old scores. Much of the 20th century's attitude towards classical music has been shaped by a prioritization of faithfulness to the musical text in pursuit of an objective understanding of the composer's original intent. Text editions, which are academically researched and edited versions of the music, are perhaps the most esteemed source of musical information to be converted into a performance. There is at times a prevalent puritanical mindset that idealizes the notion of a musical score with little to no editorial interference and no reference to external performance traditions. Just the text, the untainted directive from the composer. But in the same way the text of a Shakespeare play cannot tell us exactly how we ought to speak the words, the mere written score is simply inefficient in guaranteeing that we can achieve a musical and technical execution of a piece at the highest level. So what are we to do about this thing called interpretation? The music of Franz Liszt lends itself especially well to this discussion because of its expressive depth, its diverse technical elements, the abundance of musical alternatives provided by the composer, and performance traditions that have developed around this music. Before proceeding to the discussion on the works by Franz Liszt, I'd like to give a concise summary of his legacy in the world of piano composition and performance. Born on October 22nd, 1811, Franz Liszt skyrocketed to fame as a virtuoso soloist, playing his own works as well as the works of those of his predecessors and his contemporaries. He established the paradigm of the touring concert pianist, performing alone at the keyboard from memory, astonishing audiences with amazing technical and musical feats. And yet, contrary to popular belief, his technical wizardry was never at the expense of deeper artistic expression. What is often dismissed as empty, bombastic, virtuoso fireworks is a fundamental misunderstanding of Liszt's desire to orchestrate the piano and produce a grandeur of sound and of scale that surpassed even Beethoven's attempt to write for our instrument in this manner, in a symphonic manner. His fascination with orchestral playing is evidenced in his compositions, where he had a particular affinity for transcriptions. He made solo versions of the Beethoven symphonies. He often wrote paraphrases on Italian opera and made arrangements of works by Berlioz, just to name a few. This also served the function of giving the music of other composers exposure to the far reaches of Europe during his tours, where the locals may not have had access to orchestra concerts or full-scale opera productions. Liszt's performance career had reverberations throughout Europe. In addition to his presence in the musical centers of Paris and Vienna, he reached as far as Russia, where Mussorgsky fondly gave him the moniker, the father of Russian music. His tours in Spain also helped elevate the importance of the piano in the local music scene, and he inspired the rise of countless virtuosos such as Albéniz. In his old age, Liszt largely withdrew from public concerts, focusing on composing, teaching, as well as pursuing his own personal path towards a deeper inward spirituality. Having said that, he certainly had still had that penchant for dazzling his audiences, and on one of his return trips to Hungary, he opened the windows of his residence and played his Hungarian rhapsodies to an enthusiastic crowd outside his home. This is a barely sufficient commentary on the legacy of Franz Liszt. He's long gone, and now it is we who must give him a voice in the ever-expanding world of music. Dramatic flair and spirituality, the earthbound and the heavenly, an entertainer and an ascetic. Such sharp contrasts defined Liszt's personality as well as his music. I've chosen the Dance in the Village Inn, which is better known as the Mephisto Waltz No. 1, and his Ballade No. 2 in B minor as the works to discuss this evening, because they encapsulate this Lisztian essence, as well as provide an abundance of musical material for our discussion on interpretation. Returning now to my central question, how do we go about interpreting familiar music, and what tools do we have? We are fortunate to have access to so many resources these days, among which are urtext editions, which I have previously mentioned, are crystallized iterations of the composer's intent, supported by the work of musical scholars. Well-known collections of urtexts are produced by Henley, those ever-present blue books, and Barenreiter. Without a doubt, it is important to study these editions thoroughly and to know them very well. However, I propose that we must go beyond simply relying on urtext editions and refer to other sources of musical information. Next, we have performer editions, which are musical scores filtered through the experiences, tastes, and traditions of renowned historical musicians as well as living musicians. They offer solutions for a mechanically facile and musically effective performance. In these editions, we encounter a more subjective approach to the music in comparison to the relative objectivity of urtext editions. In the case of piano repertoire, performer editions often offer technical solutions which take into account modern pianos with their heavier action and more robust sound, where sometimes a change in fingering or a redistribution of the notes in between the hands might guarantee a more physically comfortable and secure execution of certain passages. Among the most famous performer editions for piano repertoire are Alfred Cortot's edition of Chopin and Arthur Schnabel's editions of the Beethoven sonatas. They represent a collection of musical insights gained from a lifetime of studying, teaching, and performing these works. Next, we have recordings, which in my view are perhaps the most important non-textual resource that we have for studying music. Historical recordings are even more concrete representations of the composer's tastes and musical ideas, especially in the cases of composers like Debussy, Rachmaninoff, and Prokofiev, who are among the composers who recorded a good number of their own works. And in these records, we discover that their view of their own compositions was far more flexible in tempo, in articulation, and dynamics than modern ears might expect. Sometimes they even alter the notes in their own recordings. In the case of Liszt, we don't have recordings of him because he lived quite a long time ago, but we do have recordings of his students, among whom are Emil von Sauer, Moritz Rosenthal, Arthur Friedheim, and Friedrich Lehmann, which bring us closer to the traditions and style of his day. Listening to recordings is an immersive experience of the music as a recipient rather than a recreator of sound. It helps us form our own tastes by interacting with a variety of musical interpretations. We shouldn't just passively listen, but we should seriously engage with recordings. What do we like? What do we not like? And why? And of course, we have written historical accounts which provide insights into how the composer might have approached his own music or her music and performance. The historical, cultural, and biographical context of the works that we learn is of incredible value. The specific materials that I've selected for this discussion this evening are an urtext edition of Mephisto Waltz, produced by pianist Leslie Howard, a Henley urtext of the Ballade in B minor, a performer edition of Earl Wild, an American pianist, of both works, a transcription of Liszt's orchestral version of Mephisto Waltz, and that transcription is by Ferruccio Busoni, and a selection of recordings that include Horowitz, Van Cliburn, Earl Wild, and a few others. So textual fidelity or faithfulness to the musical score in Liszt is a particularly nuanced discussion because his works often exist in a multiplicity of editions. For instance, in the case of the Transcendental Etudes, he published several versions of them, and even if something is final, it doesn't necessarily mean that those ideas have been explored exhaustively. It's just there was a due date, he had to submit something, and they were up to his standard at that time. Something like the Petrarch sonnets also existed in art song form, and then in a solo piano transcription, and then a revised solo piano transcription. And sometimes within a final, quote-unquote, edition of the work, Liszt still would offer us alternative passages. Now, these could be alternatives in terms of how to actually finger or distribute the notes between the hands, but they could also be musically different. And in the case of Mephisto Waltz, there's quite a number of these. In other words, he imagined multiple ways of conveying the same musical thought. Mephisto Waltz exists in 3 versions: the solo piano, which I will present this evening, an orchestral version, which he actually wrote before the solo piano version, and a 4-hands version, which is more or less an adaptation of the orchestral version for 4 hands. And we also have Ferruccio Busoni's transcription, which is a solo piano transcription of Liszt's orchestral arrangement of Mephisto Waltz. So the work is based on a scene from Linnau's Faust, a moment of absolute revelry with dancing, drinking, and lovemaking as the two main characters go to a village inn for a night of pleasure. Mephistopheles seizes a violin, stirring the audience with his playing, while Faust slips out with a lady into the night under the starlit evening with nightingales singing in the background. Like characters in the story, it is helpful to know the themes of this work so we can keep track of them as the musical narrative progresses. So the first one, we have the waltz theme, and we can imagine a confident Mephistopheles seizing the violin and getting everyone to dance. And next we have the love theme with its lyricism and its sensuousness depicting Faust with his lover. The next theme we have is the nightingale theme, sometimes called the devil's theme, and it creates a dark and mysterious atmosphere. There are numerous details to cover, but in the interest of time, I've selected a set of samples which I think highlight a few important points: musical effect, technical security, and updated scholarship on the music, which I think are important and essential elements to a well-rounded interpretation. If we had all the time in the world, we could also listen to a variety of recordings and discuss artistic choices and the effectiveness of each version. But for now, I'll just mention and describe a few which I felt have been most influential in forming my own understanding and interpretation of music. So first, I'd like to mention Vladimir Horowitz and Van Cliburn, who are very highly personalized in their interpretations, and they also set an example of combining different editions. In this case, they combined Liszt's original solo piano version with Busoni's orchestral transcription, and they also added their own little flourishes, and they have their own codas to the piece. Next, we have Earl Wild and Leslie Howard, who are also responsible for producing some of the editions I'm working with tonight. And it offers a study in contrast between Earl Wild's more subjective and highly personalized approach, where he records some of his own alterations, and that's in contrast to Leslie Howard's more objective and sober approach that's more or less literal to the Urtext edition. And of course, I have to mention, it's important for pianists to know the orchestral version of Mephisto Waltz. So I've selected the recording by Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. It gives us a source of inspiration for colors and timbres and expression that really open up the possibilities for the piano. Speaking more generally, pianists are really at the height of their powers when we explore the potential of our instrument to simulate the sounds and gestures of other instruments, as well as of the human voice. You know, sometimes we're a brass section. And sometimes maybe we're gracefully frolicking woodwind instruments. And sometimes we're an opera singer in the middle of a recitative. There's so much inspiration to be found in the sounds that are beyond our instrument. Now, actually getting to Liszt's score, the first alternative that he provides us is in the second theme area, that love theme. Later on, that theme develops into this melody. And one version that Liszt gives us is in octaves. It reflects the way it's done in the orchestral version, and I also feel it allows for greater melodic continuity in the theme. The other and more commonly played version is a fleet-fingered, elaborate variation on that theme. which kind of imbues the music with a kind of whimsical quality, and it's certainly more fingery and pianistic in a way. It can be, now choosing between the two versions can be a technical decision. It could be just what's more physically comfortable for the performer. It could also be based on the responsiveness of the instrument, but it can also be a musical decision that's rooted in wanting to stay closer to the orchestral version or to present the music in a more pianistic way. And I think it's also a matter of pacing and emotional quality that the performer desires. I think the slower octave version projects a sort of inner yearning and melancholy, while the brisk embellished version kind of produces a graceful melancholy. Another interesting thing that we gain from the updated urtext is this alternate bridge passage from between the first theme and the second theme. So as Liszt wraps up that first theme, we have the second theme. Now that transition is characterized by these falling seconds and these half diminished and fully diminished harmonies. Now there's an alternate passage found in newly discovered manuscripts that expands on that idea. Kind of develops that falling second motif in a sort of improvised manner. And another passage that's of interest in Mephisto Waltz is the harp cadenza, which can be inserted between measures 863 and 864. And it's also from newly discovered album leaves in the updated urtext. And this brings the solo piano version closer to the orchestral version, where there's also a harp cadenza. It's right after that. There's a sort of recitative moment in the music where we finally arrive at a place of rest before the conclusion. Now, typically, the solo piano version would just go into the fanfare that leads us to the conclusion. But here, in the orchestral version, I'll play with Busoni's transcription first. We have a harp cadenza. To the conclusion. The updated version from the urtext goes a little something like this. And then on to the conclusion. And I think this, as well as that bridge passage that I showed earlier, gives us a chance to add a little bit of a sense of spontaneity and unexpectedness, and it gives us a chance to explore new material from the composer and add an extra layer of freshness and newness to an interpretation of such a familiar work. It is important to remember that Liszt and all great composers were phenomenal improvisers, and their music should feel inspired in the moment. Music, after all, is only static when it's on the printed page, but in the active performance, I think we should make choices that allow the music to come alive and always feel fresh and unexpected. Now, beyond Liszt's solo piano edition, I borrow some musical details from Busoni and Wilde. In measures 149 and 245, there's this sort of playful passage. In Liszt's original, he writes these 30-second notes that have the effect of giggling. Which is very effective and very humorous. I personally prefer Busoni's transcription of how Liszt does it in the orchestral version, which our 16th note runs. music of party animals. Now, the coda is a moment where I have a bit of fun and I combine Liszt, Busoni, and Wild. So the ending in Liszt's original goes something like this. Which is a very colorful and perhaps darker and more sinister conclusion to the music. Earl Wild offers a more decisively happy conclusion, and he brings back that first theme. That waltz theme. So Earl Wild's coda goes like this. Very clever writing that integrates Liszt's original thematic material. And in between, so this is Earl Wild's coda, a bit more extended. And in between that, I add a touch of Busoni's transcription of a string section tremolo. So to bridge Liszt's writing and Earl Wild, so it goes something like this. And so on. Now lastly for a more technical example, we have the passage in measure 813, which can certainly be executed in one hand as Liszt wrote it. No problems there, but it is about 10 minutes into the music where that passage occurs, and after all of the excitement and the drama, it's easy to be exhausted physically. And if you have a heavier instrument, that might be quite a strain on your fingers. So Earl Wild suggests taking that passage and dividing it between the hands. Much more physically comfortable. And it also relies on fingering that will be familiar to pianists practicing their scales. And in the words of Earl Wild, it safely creates a greater sense of brilliance. Now, this is just a fraction of the information and the insight gained from considering all these sources written and recorded, and I hope it offers some inspiration and interest in taking a fresh look at such a familiar work. And now I present to you Liszt's Dance in the Village Inn, also better known as his Mephisto Waltz No. 1. So the second piece that I have for you today, this evening, is Liszt's Ballade in B minor. Here we are similarly presented with an array of options with which we can craft a musically effective interpretation. First, a few words on the piece itself. While perhaps less known than his other solo piano pieces, the Ballade in B minor is truly a monumental work that encapsulates Liszt's virtuosity, his poetry, and his gifts for thematic transformation. Written around the same time and in the same key as his landmark piano sonata, I fondly think of this piece as being Little Sibling, half the duration, but containing all the power and drama of its older sibling. Sources suggest that Liszt may have been inspired by the Greek tragedy of Hero, a priestess of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and her lover, Leander, a young man from Abydos, who would swim across the Hellespont at night for their secret meetings. It's built on two main themes, the first of which is an ominous one that kind of happens over a rumbling, chromatic texture. Kind of imagine it's the dark, stormy waters that Leander has to swim across. And the second theme is a contrasting one, an angelic chorale, which is probably when Hero and Leander are reunited. To stop playing because it's such a nice melody. But the emotional arc of the piece is actually shaped by the journey of the first theme. So as I mentioned, it starts in a very dark place. And later it passes through a storm. Takes us through that storm, but later on we arrive in B major, the parallel major, where the theme is transformed into something really magical. Liszt has so transformed the emotional quality of that main theme that it can be tough to imagine that we're actually working with the same material he started us off with. Now, Liszt's Aussia, or alternative passages, mostly occur in this B major section with the final statements of the theme. In the final statement on measure 292, he gives us two variants in how to close off this first theme. The first and more commonly played one is the theme as a chorale with an ocean of scales that sort of travels the entirety of the keyboard. The second one is just chords. And so on. That decision can be made based on technical preference. Some pianists might feel more comfortable with chords and others might fare better with scales. Musically too, there's quite a difference in the emotional quality with the majestic manner of the chords and the surging or swelling passion of the scales. I think the decision can also be made based on the desire to differentiate this final statement of the theme with the immediately preceding one, which is also a combination of chords and scales. Speaking of that statement, Earl Wild gives us a useful alternative. So as I mentioned, that theme is presented also as a chorale. And Liszt's original has the scales written down here in the low register of the piano. Separated by one octave. Earl Wild suggests that we separate the scales by 2 octaves. us a more orchestral effect. Now, I think that's a decision that can be based on the quality of the instrument that the pianist is performing in, and also the acoustic space, where if you separate the scales by just an octave, it might result in a darker and unclear texture in certain places or on certain instruments. So the music might benefit from thinning out the texture by spreading the scales 2 octaves apart. Now, the final thing I'd like to talk about is the coda of the Ballade in B minor. Similar to the B minor sonata, Liszt conceived of multiple codas, and in both cases, he ultimately preferred inwardness over the exuberance of his earlier material. The sonata and the ballade were written by Liszt around the time he was approaching his 50s and becoming a much more introverted and spiritual person, and I think his musical choices certainly reflected this period of his life. The coda that Liszt ultimately published revisits the second theme of the work, and it retains its beautifully expressive and tender quality. And it ends on a beautiful series of chords. He leaves us with that exquisitely beautiful, poetic 6/5 suspension. Now, Liszt's earlier coda also comes back to the second theme, but he actually transforms it into a triumphant march. It exists in a smaller and larger variant that develops the same material, and it goes something like this. Cascade of octaves. Very different in temperament from what he ultimately published. But even though he chose the more poetic and inward coda, he did leave the alternatives available to us, and he invites us to take a different view. He didn't toss them into the fire as someone like Brahms might have. And selecting these earlier codas provides an opportunity to experience and present the musical material in the manner of a younger, red-blooded, romantic Liszt, with his exuberance and his heroism. I'd like to mention a few recordings of the Ballade that are worth a listen. First, we have Goran Filipec, who chooses the earlier coda. And I think it's worth kind of listening to both and making our own comparisons before we pick which one to learn and perform. We also have Arkady Volodos and Hao Chen Zhang, who incorporate Liszt's alternative chordal passage in 292. Same thing, I think it's always good to know your options, to experience them from the point of view of the listener, and that helps you make a judgment call about which one you'd like to learn and present. And once again, I have to include Earl Wild and Leslie Howard. Wonderful recordings, and again, it's that useful contrast between subjectivity and objectivity. To know the work in its original sort of poor text edition, but also know that there's a spectrum of artistic choices that we can make to highlight certain musical details. Can't stress enough how vital it is to explore recordings in order to discover a wide variety of possibilities of tempo, dynamic range, phrasing, emotional sweep, articulation, and countless other details. Now, before I play Liszt's Ballade in B minor, I want to reflect a bit on a quote from the renowned Canadian pianist, Glenn Gould. He was discussing the state of classical music performance in the 20th century, and he said, "I think if one is going to pursue performance at a time when the greatest performances of the past and of the present have been made permanent in record catalogs for everyone to hear, one must indeed recompose the music, or find another way to make a living. I don't think there is an excuse for performance performance that simply duplicates what's been done before. Quite a tall order for Mr. Gould and a controversial one, as he was very known for his polarizing statements. But if we are to take on this challenge, we live at the ideal time for it. We are fortunate to be able to revisit these old piano masterpieces with access to a plethora of Urtext editions, performer editions with valuable insights, an encyclopedic recording catalog, and a diversity of working historical accounts. We can feel empowered to go beyond a mere objective academic reading of the musical text and synthesize a variety of sources to inform more personal choices as we study this music. And these choices ought to be made less with a dogmatic distinction between correct and incorrect, and more with a spirit of exploration in the world of sound and expression. And this, in my view, is the essence of musical interpretation. And now I'd like to present Liszt's Ballade in B minor. you.